All right. So what I want to talk about today, and I sort of rephrased a little bit the sort of theme of the conference is, exploring this idea that, if we want to make a better tomorrow, we have to do that through developing our people. That's the only way to do it. And I want to talk about that through about 38 years of mistakes that I've made. I find that's the best way to learn something. And that does not mean I'm 38, unfortunately. It means we're going to start the story when I was about 17, because before that, of course, I did everything perfectly, right? So I'm going to cover a couple things, a little bit of personal history. I think it's always useful to understand where someone comes from if you want to understand where they're going to go. And then I'll talk about Rebuild, which is the business that we've been building for the last 3 years here. And then all of this, again, will be in the context of essentially a lot of mistakes and foibles over many years. So we'll start by talking in 1986. And I grew up in New York, basically living on two major food groups, pizza and bagels. And this was much to my mother's chagrin. She was like a great cook, but literally that's all I ate for like 17 or 18 years. I also ate a lot of, and those of you from this area will know what this is, and the rest of you will be like, what is that? Well, did I hear someone? Carvel ice cream. So if you're from Long Island, you know Carvel ice cream. It was founded by a guy named Tom Carvel, who should be in the pantheon of greatness with Deming and Duran and everybody. That's a lot. And the reason is, if you take a look at this here, this is a Father's Day ice cream cake in the shape of a whale for some unknown reason. But in any case, he also was so masterful as to be able to use that same cake pan to make a Christmas Santa cake. So this is really, I think, lean in practice. And so, lean is all around you if you just look, even if they haven't been formally trained. And so Tom Carvel should, again, as I said, right up there with Toyota Production System. In any case, so that's where I got my beginnings in terms of my sports team interests and the way I speak and how fast I do or don't talk and that kind of thing. In any event, in 1986, around that time, I think for those of you that are my era and those of you that have read about it, this was a time when there was a lot of consternation about the US industrial base, and there was a lot of real industrial decay happening in the country. And specifically, there was a lot of concern about the competitiveness of our industries vis-a-vis the Japanese, right? People were concerned about the auto industry, machine tools, semiconductor. Those were some of the big areas that people really were concerned that we were really being taken to the woodshed. Japan was just outperforming us, basically. If at that time you had said, don't worry about Japan, it's China you need to worry about, you would have been laughed out of the room, right? Which is kind of interesting, I think. In any event, so I was 17 years old, and at that time, it's very easy to be a linear thinker and quite idealistic, and I thought, oh, I should do something about this, right? I think it's important to have a strong industrial base. It's good jobs. Running a democracy and having all our freedoms is expensive. I like the way we live, and we want to kind of make our country better. You have to make profits, and to do that, you have to make things. So if we're going to lose our industry to other countries, that's bad. So I should do something about that. So what should I do about that? Well, I should clearly have a factory. Okay, and if I should have a factory, then how am I going to do that? I should become an engineer. If I'm going to be an engineer, where should I go to become an engineer? Well, this is pre-internet, so I biked down to the library and determined that MIT is a good engineering school, so I should apply there. So again, this is the time of the rotary phone, so made some calls and eventually applied in 1986 and was accepted mostly because they needed a goaltender on their ice hockey team, not because I was actually qualified. But I managed to get in, and I survived, and I got a job there as a machinist. And so I became a machinist, and I spent my time operating two machine tools, basically, a Daewoo Puma lathe and a Cincinnati Millicron VMC. And I'm sure you can guess at this juncture which one had 98% uptime and which one had 2% uptime. And this was really disturbing to me, right? This sort of machine that we made here in Ohio was literally down all the time. It didn't work. And this Daewoo Puma lathe, which cost less, was just bulletproof and just went and went and went. The other thing I learned from this experience that was really interesting to me was this was kind of the beginnings of CNC control systems, so computer numerical controls to operate all these things. Not quite the beginning, but there had been some serious advances at this time driven by Alan Bradley, Fanuc, and GE at the time, actually. And what was really interesting was the design of all those systems was intended to remove decision-making from the floor and push it to engineers. So engineers would write programs that would be downloaded to these machines, and we, as the machinists, would be often locked out of those. And so invariably, you would start to run these programs, they would not work properly, tools would crash into fixturing, there would be chattering, or the depth of cut would be too high, or the spindle speed too slow, and you'd get smoke, or the tool would burn out. And then you'd have to try and find this engineer to make changes to this program. And invariably, they were out to lunch or doing something else, right? And so we ended up, they're not in these pictures, but sitting on some stools reading the newspaper, which probably just reinforced their idea that we weren't doing any work and that they needed to have more control over production to dictate the pace of production. So in any case, a guy I went to MIT with, and I started a company at this time to try to change the way these CNC control systems work. We essentially wanted to bring Apple Macintosh type sensibility to them, make them more conversational, and also be able to capture the machinist input and then use that to modify the program, so to create kind of a closed loop system there. So we developed a system where you could modify the speeds and feeds in real time. The system would capture those and then overlay them on the program so you'd capture that machinist's knowledge. So I like to think of it as like an early precursor to machine learning, except human in the loop. So in any case, the other things that happened during this time is I read 2 books. I read more than 2 books, but these are the 2 books that really mattered. The first was a book called When the Machine Stopped, which gave the story about a company called Bergmaster, which was a California-based machine tool company, quite prominent previous to this time, and the story of how they ended up being acquired by a PE-backed industrial firm, PE meaning private equity, I'll come to that in a minute, and ultimately how they pushed offshore, and that led to the demise of their business, essentially, as they lost their IP, they lost control of their product, and they essentially gave birth to, for those of you that are machine tool nerds, a company called Yamazaki Mazak, which is now Mazak, which is kind of now the largest and most successful machine tool builder in the world. And that was all born of the decisions that were made by this parent company of this business. This was also just as a funny little side story, an interesting time, because all my friends were going into packet switch networks and other kinds of stuff that seemed super boring to me. And I ended up running machine tools, and I loved it, but they ended up selling all their businesses to Cisco for 9 figures or whatever it was. So sometimes you have to just stick with what you love, I guess. I also read this book, which I'm sure everyone here is somewhat familiar with, Jim Womack et al.'s book, The Machine That Changed the World. And again, this just reinforced for me this concern that we had to do something about the industrial situation here. So I was fortunate enough to get into graduate school, also at MIT. At that time, it was called the MIT Leaders for Manufacturing program. It was founded to help rejuvenate US industry and bring new management methods, including lean, to US companies. They sold out several years later and changed it to Leaders for Global Operations so that they could take money from wherever and work with whomever. That was a great disappointment in my life. But in any event, a few other things I picked up in school that were really important were, one, I learned about the Toyota Production System, or Lean. I met a guy named Shoji Shiba. He was one of our professors. He had developed a system called TQM, which he described as kind of like breakthrough management, essentially. So a way to identify customer needs that they can't express that lead to real increases in product value. It was just very fascinating, and I found that very impactful over the years. And then I met a lot of really great people, one of whom pictured here, Jeff Wilke, happened to be in grad school with me at MIT, and he went to Amazon in 2000 and ended up running their operations, helping develop everything that you think of as Prime, and then ran the whole consumer business there. So had a really great career there for about 20 years, and in 2020, we ended up reconnecting to found Rebuild, and I'll come back to that. Anyway, the company I started in graduate school, I ended up selling to a local machine tool builder, and that machine tool builder was bought by a private equity firm, and that led me into the dark private equity years of my career. The firm that bought my company got into a lot of trouble. It was very mismanaged. They basically doubled sales, but tripled employment, quadrupled inventory, and quintupled losses. It was kind of their game plan, I guess. And when the PE firm figured out what was happening, they fired all the management, and I was running the subsidiary I had started 30 miles away. And so I drove down there right away because I was worried I was going to lose my job. And I'm sorry that I'm biasing left, by the way. Apologize for that. I said, hey, I have this degree from MIT. I was 24, I think. do you need someone to do anything? And they were like, they patted me on the head, like, nice kid, we're going to get professionals in here. But no one would come. It was such a train wreck. And so I spent the better part of the next 6 years running and turning around this business, and that got me a reputation as being a turnaround expert. And so then I spent the next, whatever it was, 14 years doing turnarounds of industrial and engineering companies in private equity. And during that, I observed a couple of things, which I want to talk about. One, the prevalence of short-term thinking, right? So for those of you not familiar, a typical private equity environment, you're raising a fund that might have a 10-year life. You invest that fund over a number of years, and then you have to redeem those funds, i.e. sell the companies to make your money. So you only make your money, and it's a lot of money, when you sell the company for a gain. So you use a lot of debt so that you get more mileage out of your equity, and often you'll get 20% of the ups. So whatever you sell, the profits, 20% goes to the partnership of the private equity firm. So there's a huge motivation to buy and sell very quickly, because only by showing that you've succeeded in improving companies, in air quotes, over a couple of years, can you raise your next fund. And you're always in this cycle of trying to raise your next fund. So this kind of very short-term thinking has become very prevalent in the US economy writ large. So even though not all companies are owned by private equity, it infected, I think, along with the kind of things that Jack Welch sort of drove through GE, this very short-termism kind of behavior. And again, I'm not trying to disparage anyone particularly, but that's just how I see it. And so this became very much the standard by which most companies were judged. Can you generate returns like the private equity folks? And so everyone started engaging in this behavior. What that led to, invariably, was short-term easy fixes, of which offshoring is one. It's a lot easier to close your plant and pay someone else to take on your problems than it is to continuously and in small measure improve it over many, many years, right? And so again, if you're only going to be in a business for 3 or 4 years, this is an easy choice to make, right? When you're going to be in a business for decades, it's another matter, of course. So the other thing that came along with this is what I call the Chipotle problem. Now, I should say, I've been advised by our legal lawyers to say Chipotle is a very nice business, and I like Chipotle food, and you should too, great place. But it was all this idea that, oh, the industrial economy is like yesterday's news. We're moving into a service economy, and that's going to be so much better, and we should all move in that direction and abandon all this manufacturing and technical production nonsense, basically. The problem is those jobs look like Chipotle. And what does that job look like? Well, if you've been in a Chipotle, I think you could probably appreciate that within 2 to 4 weeks max, me 4, you probably 2, you could probably master every task in a Chipotle restaurant. And what that means is that there's very little room for productivity growth. And if there's very little room for productivity growth, there's very little room for wage growth, and that means that those are dead-end jobs, right? And so we've traded as a country a lot of really good manufacturing and technically oriented jobs for these service jobs in retail, restaurants, hospitality, et cetera, that really don't have the kind of leverage on people's time or innovative abilities or creativity that jobs making things or developing new things have. And there just simply will never be enough jobs in the higher-end engineering and software development part of it to cover for all those manufacturing and other types of jobs that your average high school graduate can take and make a great life for themselves and participate in the American dream. Working at Chipotle is not going to let you participate in the American dream, unfortunately. And that's part of the situation we have today and part of what motivated us, as I'll talk about in a little bit, to develop this company called Rebuild. The other thing that we saw a lot of is, and I think it was just mentioned earlier, this idea of leaning out a process. So private equity adopted lean, but their own version of it, which was, let's go in and use lean principles to cut costs. That will boost our profits. We will then sell the company and we're out of there, right? And the new owner may or may not continue those principles. They may or may not continue that culture. And so I think lean has gotten kind of a bad rep in a lot of places as actually air cover for just cutting costs. And that's something that we should all be very concerned about and working to disavow people of, because if you use lean in this way, I think it really negatively affects the likelihood that we can use it the right way. I'll give you a quick example of this, a company that I was involved with trying to turn around called Rug Doctor. You may or may not be familiar with. They make these carpet cleaning machines that for many, many years, and still today, you could rent at a grocery store, something like this. So when your dog peed on the carpet or your kid knocked over your coffee, you'd rent one of these for the day and clean your carpet, right? So this was a profitable, founder-led company for many years, and they sold to a private equity firm. And the first thing they did was move manufacturing offshore. So they closed their production plant and moved all the production of the unit to China. And so what happened is they had a nice immediate bump in profits, and they had a reduction in their asset base. So their return on invested capital looked great. So it looked like, wow, we've really changed this company in 24 months, right? And they sold it to the next private equity shop on that basis, who, inappropriately projected that those cash flows would continue forever, and they could therefore count on that and put more debt on it. And what they did the next time, their plan was, let's move the engineering offshore. And so then they started to depend upon their Chinese supplier to take on the engineering of the product. So now they've eliminated their ability to not only make the product, which comes with lots of information that helps you design the product, as you well know, but they also lost the ability to actually make changes to their own product. And so, well, what do you think happened? What happened is this. Their supplier in China started producing these products, and that's basically the exact same guts as the other one, for other people. And Rug Doctor couldn't do anything about it. In fact, it got so bad that Rug Doctor, and this is on the third PE ownership now, right? That Rug Doctor and Bissell would essentially slug it out for who would get whatever new design the Chinese supplier said they were willing to make this year. So the Chinese supplier would say, this year, this is going to be what we do. Who wants it, and what are you willing to pay for it? They would slug it out, so they're collapsing their margins as this happens, of course. And all of the sort of leverage and all of the dynamism of the business is now gone, essentially. And I'll just remind you, because I'm sure you've heard this, but this all happened in this context of, oh, this is better, we're an asset-light business, it's just a marketing business, this is great, and the production, we don't have to worry about that, it just comes over. If the product isn't good, we just send it back. It just doesn't work, right? And so now Bissell is in the same mode. They've developed other products. They're being made by that and some other companies, and you're starting to see the same thing happen over again. Those products are now available to others from that same supply chain, and so you have this real, I think, negative impact as a function of this kind of behavior. All right, moving on. So why rebuild? What did we want to do here? There are sort of three things that drove us to want to form this business, and I'll describe what it is in a minute. The first is, I've spoken a lot about this, but it's our view, and I appreciate that you could debate this, that having industry and engineering-oriented production in this country is really important to the health of the economy and to the health of our social political system, because it gives people, and I mean by that, the vast majority of us, the average person who didn't go to a great college and have an engineering degree and whatever, the ability to participate in the participate in the American dream through meaningful work. And when you don't have that, I think it leads to populism. And that leads to different things in red states than blue states, but it's the same thing. If you're in a red state, the government screwed this whole thing up, and you want to have the government shut down. If you're in a blue state, it's the private companies that screw the whole thing up, and the state should do something about it. But it leads to a real caustic environment, which I think we're experiencing today, frankly. The other thing is we needed to figure out, and Rebuild is an experiment, to try and create a model of industrialization or a new form of large-scale industrial platform that works in the American system, right? So that works for our culture, that works for the way that people here want to do things and what they value and what they don't. And last, as I noted before, democracy is kind of an expensive thing, so you need to generate quite a bit of profits and have profitable activities to pay for it. So how would it work? Two main points to make here. The first thing is, when we look at the American landscape of industrial companies, there are a very large number of small to mid-sized companies that are very technically deep but narrowly construed. And the challenge is, and this is also a challenge for lean and in general people, there therefore have to be many interfaces between these companies to create something. And those interfaces are where things tend to fall down and where you have problems. So we wanted to see if we could come up with a form of conglomeration where we could bring companies like that together, create a much lower friction method or way for them to interact with each other to take on large-scale, multidisciplinary industrial manufacturing challenges. Because the other thing that's going on is, as you think about products and the development of them, whether they're commercial or consumer-oriented, is they tend to include more and more technologies of different types. There's not just wood in a product anymore, right, say, or plastic. They tend to be part of systems. That's where the value is, that's where the innovation is. And so being able to stitch these capabilities together to deliver that is something that we don't have in spades here. Whereas if you go to Japan or Korea or China, they do. They have these large-scale organizations that cover broad surface area of technology. So there are two things that kind of stood in our way of doing this. Man, I'm really running out of time. There are two things that stood in our way of doing this. The first was the short-term thinking I described earlier. The other, and I'll touch on this a little bit later if I'm given the time to do so, is this idea of the idolatry of the innovator. So one of the positives and negatives of American culture is that we love technical innovation and we kind of worship people that drive it, right? So whether it's Steve Jobs or Edison or Elon Musk, yes, there can be some polarizing views around these people, but the fact is that we generally tend to assign huge value to the idea that a person drove innovation, right? That it was born of a single mind, right? And the problem with this is that while, of course, there is a role for that, and entrepreneurs kind of embody this principle, progress depends much more so on the collaboration of a very large number of people to make something happen, right? And that's increasingly true as problems get more technically sophisticated and, as I noted before, multidisciplinary. And what it also means is that this stands in the way, in my view, of lean as a concept being very broadly adopted, because if you believe that great ideas come from individuals and there are big step changes and that's the way you get progress, it's a lot harder to convince people to work on improving something a small amount every day for the next 6,000 days and that that's the way to compete. We as a culture, I think, and I'm making a generalization, I appreciate that, tend to look for the big step change, right? Right now it's AI, right? AI is going to fix all problems, it's going to be unbelievable, it's going to do 8,000 incredible things, and it's doing them by next Tuesday, right? There's some truth to that, but it's certainly overblown, and we think that meter needs to be kind of moved. So how do we address these two problems that we think are in the way of building a strong U.S. technically oriented industrial business? The way we did that is we started by generating a set of principles that we felt would drive everything we could do in the business, that would give us clarity at moments when we might have confusion about what to do or face ethical challenges in our business and so on. And Jeff, who founded the business with me and a couple of other people, had a lot of experience doing this through his Amazon days, but we needed to generate our own version of these things. And so I want to call your attention to three of these in particular as they relate to developing people, which is what we're talking about here. The first is the eighth principle, which is that we buy businesses for the long term at Rebuild. We don't intend to sell them, right? So that principle means that we are vested in our companies and our people for a very long period of time. And it has a huge impact on the way we think about development and who we hire and the skills they do or don't need to have and how we're going to get them the skills they need. Because if we're going to be in this forever, a quarter century, a half century, et cetera, as you can imagine, you think about that very differently than if you're buying a business and you're going to flip it in 3 years. If I'm buying a business and I'm going to flip it in 3 years, I don't need to develop you at all, and I'm not going to do it, right? It's illogical to do that, right? The second principle in this regard I want to point to is the 11th principle, which is that we culturally are committed to providing people with long-term opportunities to develop themselves professionally in our business and to share in the rewards of that. And that has many ramifications for how we organize our business, again, what we expect from our people and what they can expect from the company, and the idea that we want people to be at our business for their whole professional life if possible. Like, we start from that point. That doesn't mean we guarantee people permanent employment. There's moral hazards with that, but it means that our goal is to, as long as you can find a way to contribute to the business and you're interested to do it, we want to have you in our business. And that really shapes a lot of our decision making. And this all then kind of drives to the 15th principle, which is that we are built on lean, right? By which I mean we want lean not to be something we do, but how we do everything, right? And that's a very important principle in our business, and as I hope to have a little bit of time to tell you about, has shaped a lot of what we do. I want to also just point out the second principle because it's my favorite. You're probably familiar with Machiavelli. Machiavelli's concept was the end justifies the means, which in its most coarse interpretation you could take to mean if you have some end in mind that's moral or just, it's okay to do things that are not moral or just on the way to that point. Now, there are many shades of that, but that's really how we practice business and a lot of things in this country and actually much of the West. And it's our view that that is a fallacy. You can't plan the end. You don't know where you're going to go, right? How many of you here 10 years ago thought you'd be in the role you are, doing the thing you're doing, et cetera? Or if you go back 15 years or 20, I'm sure the answer is almost none. And so if you will do anything to get to some specific goal that is, in theory, good, the chances are you're going to do a lot of caustic things along the way and not get what you thought you were going to get in the first place. And I think of offshoring and this kind of short-termism is very much fitting into this mode of thinking. So for us, yes, we have plans, yes, we have goals, but what's much more important is, are we living our values and are we doing things the right way today and tomorrow and next week and next month? And that will then, things will take care of themselves because we can't guarantee the end anyway, right? There's external shocks that might change the conditions under which we're operating. The world changes. We can be wrong about something. Very often we're wrong about things. But if we can be happy and comfortable with what we've done along the way, then we will be in a much better place. And so that's, again, a very fundamental principle of our business. And this all, again, I wanted to just revisit this here. For us, when we speak about lean, we mean, little font problem there, continuous improvement through respect for people. So that is where we start every conversation about everything we're going to do, and every improvement we seek to make in our business, we want to make sure that it demonstrates respect for not just our customers and our vendors and our shareholders, but just as much the people that are in the business. They are the business. The company is nothing without them, obviously. So I'll fly through these next couple slides because I want to get to a few other things. But today we're about 1,000 people or so, almost 400 of which are engineers. And our role in life is to take on complex, multidisciplinary engineering and production problems for our customers. About half our customers are startups that are developing new technology. We want to help those companies develop supply chains in the US and not migrate offshore from the onset. To give you an example, you all are familiar, I'm sure, with lithium batteries, right? Well, 90% of the original technology around that, including LFP and all those, were developed here. The problem was and remains, you can't run a decent-sized pilot line in the US. There are only 2 that you can run pilot production on. So all these new chemistries, they go to China to get run for pilot production, and they never come back, right? So we want to change that dynamic in the markets where we're interested. And so that's about half of our customer base, and the other half are more established companies for whom we, again, design and or build products. We have 4 principal kind of organizing, I guess we have 4 organizing principles that I won't have time to go through in full, but essentially the first is the areas we're interested in, which is life sciences, lightweighting, so we do a lot in composites, specialized metallics. Electrification, we have a large practice in developing battery management systems, battery packs, battery technology, battery processing for all kinds of applications. Mobility, so a lot of our work ends up in products that move, right? That sort of goes with electrification and lightweighting, frankly. And then smart devices, so we do a lot of work developing technology that puts intelligence, sensors, decision-making, et cetera, at the edge, so on devices that are in the field. The field could be a factory, it could be a battlefield, it could be your living room, et cetera. We offer a brain-to-box set of services, so we basically start at the beginning. We'll help you design a product. We can take that all the way through the electrical engineering, firmware, mechanical, design of the automation, build your plant, hand you the keys, or run it, or any subset of that. And then we have a system of work that I won't have time to go through here, but essentially think of it as the lowest level of work. Each scale is an order of magnitude, so it's a log scale, is making stuff to print. So someone gives you a blueprint, you make their part. Right? The highest level is own product. You develop the concept yourself. You own all the IP. And there's a spectrum in there. The companies we buy tend to be operating down at this lower level. And our job and what we've been doing is helping them migrate up so that their process expertise, their knowledge, starts to generate IP that we can then share with our customers, but also makes our business stronger. And then last is lean, of course, is a very fundamental part of our business. I will skip these, but we have many locations. They do many things. And again, we do many things. So what does this mean in terms of developing people? I think this is kind of getting to the meat of it a little bit. So the first thing we want to note is the US is a high labor cost country, and we want it to stay that way. Why do I say that? Because we want people to earn a good wage and be able to participate in the economy and fulfill their personal goals. And that means high wages. So our job, and this is where lean is of course very important, is to be more efficient than the next guy, right? We have to be able to deliver more for that because wages really reflect, right? High wages reflect all of the systems we have. We have a highway system, we have a judicial system, we have a system of defense, we have a form of government. All these things cost a lot of money, and if we want to maintain those things, then we have to pay people well, basically. That means to keep that going, we have to create an environment where people ideally love their work, but at a minimum, get a lot of satisfaction out of their work and bring their best selves to work and their creative selves to work. And that means that we have to give a 10+ year kind of horizon to that work. So people have to believe that when they're coming to work for us, they have a very long horizon to develop and to contribute to the company, that it's not just a very short-term transactional thing. And that also means we have to reach back into our communities, right? There's a real dearth of technical training in this country today. And so we spend a lot of time and money developing people that we could hire into our business or into other businesses near us. And the picture here is kind of cool. This is the original Alcoa aluminum plant in New Kensington, Pennsylvania, which was closed since the 70s. And we are partnered with the state of Pennsylvania. We're splitting the cost, essentially, to refurbish that whole plant and build a new manufacturing site there. 15,000 people used to walk through those doors every day from the surrounding towns, and that dropped after the 70s to 0. So you can imagine what that did to that area. And so part of our mission is to help reindustrialize places that have been deindustrialized by the changes I talked about earlier. And then last, of course, again, continuous improvement through respect for people is the essential engine that drives all of this. And having everyone in the company participate in making the business better is our goal. So I'm out of time, but I'm going to keep going until they drag me off. I should be done in 5 minutes. All right. So a couple of things I just wanted to share with you, which you can take or leave as you want. Some things I've learned, and so hopefully if you remember anything from this at all, it'll be this. First is, it's expensive to develop people, but it must be done, and we need to do it much more actively as a country and as individual companies than has been done heretofore. Obviously, everyone talks about Germany. You go to Germany, and in high school, many of the kids will go into like a technical development type program instead of a conventional liberal arts high school. In the U.S., if you're not going to a liberal arts high school and you go to Votech, you're basically considered a problem child. I have a son that goes to a Votech. He's a welding student, and they get 10 cents on the dollar of the funding of the liberal arts high schools of that area, right? We need to change that. We need to do it as companies. We need to push our local governments to do it, but it's really important. And this is the only way that we can drive retention and drive success in these kind of technical industrial applications. The other thing I'd say that, again, probably seems obvious, but short-term, high-yield activities are not likely to last. If you can do something in a very short time and generate huge returns, then there's like a huge margin in there that can be chipped away very easily and it won't last. It takes a long time to create meaningful competitive advantage. So expect this process of development and evolution to take time. And that's again why for Rebuild, we're on a quarter-century plus journey. This isn't a 2 or 3 or 4 year journey. And the capital we raised, about $500 million, was all from family offices and other entities that are not funds so that we wouldn't face that problem. They will gain their benefit through the long-term accretion of our business long after people like me are not here anymore. The other thing I'll note here is a test I like to think about whether some change is worth doing. So we often talk about making changes that are better for customers or better for the company and so on. But if the change does not lead to betterment for the people involved with the process themselves, it is unlikely to persist in my experience. The people involved have to really get a benefit from it. Yesterday, I sat in a talk, I'm sorry, I forget the gentleman's name, but from Pella, about an improvement they made in a window technology. And what was really clear to me was that the improvements were most felt by the people who had to go do the work in the field. And that means that was going to be super sticky and really impactful in a very almost like organic way. And that's the most powerful kind of change. So I always like to run this check when we do something, and if it doesn't improve the working life of the people that are going to be involved in the process, we probably missed the boat. And then 2 little points here. One, it's very important to celebrate success. That's obvious maybe, but something we should really make sure to do. I'm wearing a shirt, for example. I'm going to have to show you my bald spot too, but anyway, here's the back of it. That Everyone that participated in a lean event at our company last year got this, like a concert t-shirt kind of, all the different events we did and so on. And I think we had, Bonnie and I were just talking about this, maybe 290 something people, a large number of people out of 1,000 that participated in events, our first full year of really heavy lean implementation. And this thing was like hotter than like a Taylor Swift shirt at our company. Like people like wanted this thing. You could not get extras, you know, there's probably a secondary market I don't know about. But the point is small things like that, celebrating those successes are really important. The other thing is if you want to drive lean to be not something you do, but the way you do everything, you need single-threaded leadership. So Bonnie Davis, right here, in the second row there, in the very bright green jacket, if you're looking for later, is our Chief Lean Officer, and we have that position as important as our Chief Operating Officer and our CFO. It's at the highest level of the company. A senior manager, this isn't something under a VP of Operations or something in a plant. Lean is our North Star. And so if you want to make that clear to everyone and you want people to dedicate the time and resources to it, you have to treat it seriously and you have to have leaders that own that at the highest level of the company. And we're very lucky to have Bonnie in that regard, certainly. For us, the biggest challenge that we see in lean implementations is in our engineering areas. So our experience is that as you move towards working with people who have more, let's say, college education and also tend to do more of their work in their mind, they tend to be more resistant to the idea that all work is a process and that you can create a process that dictates how they do things. And so I don't know if this is true. I know there's a bunch of speakers coming to talk about medical and so on, but I would imagine, for example, it's harder to get a neurosurgeon to be receptive to using a lean process to modify how they do their work than it might be like a nurse or a technician, a lab technician, a phlebotomist or something like this. In the manufacturing side, we see the same kind of problems. People that are working on the floor, they're kind of thinking of themselves already as part of a system in a process like that, and they're more receptive. And as you move towards people that are doing what they would term more intellectual work, though I would reject that characterization, but that's the characterization they might use, it's harder and harder to kind of build these lean processes, but it's where the future is. And so it's something we're going to be working really hard on in our business. And then last, again, I would say, I mentioned this earlier, but lean in my mind is the antithesis of this idea of like the singular wellspring of all ideation, the idolatry of the innovator. Lean allows people at every part of the company to contribute, and that contribution is much more valuable than having a grand thinker that sort of dictates how these things should or shouldn't be done. And so if we're going to be successful building our business, and I think in many other areas, and as a country, we have to recognize that we are wasting huge amounts of talent by treating a lot of people like they're a piece of machinery. And we shouldn't be doing that. We should be recognizing that they have something to offer, and we need to give them the tools and the education to do that. And when we pair that with, there are people who have brilliant ideation, then you have something unstoppable. And that's the formula, I think, that in the US will really work. This incredible ability to generate entrepreneurial thinking and new ideas, backed hopefully by a more substantive and stronger set of manufacturing and engineering capabilities built around lean principles. That's it. Thank you very much.